In a land where the sun burned hotter than hope, and the nights echoed with the emptiness of starving bellies, one boy learned that kindness could grow even in the harshest drought. Before he understood the world, he understood hunger. And before he understood hunger, he understood compassion. Those two forces, rising side by side inside him, would one day redraw the destiny of thousands. Cato's childhood unfolded in a village where survival was not a season, but a permanent reality. The fields surrounding their home lay cracked and thirsty, splitting open like wounds beneath the relentless African sun. Rain had become a story older people whispered about, as though unsure if it had ever truly existed. Dust coated everything: the roofs, the cooking pots, the worn paths children walked, and hunger hung in the air with the weight of something that refused to be ignored. In this unforgiving landscape, Cato's family moved with the quiet discipline of people who had learned to turn almost nothing into just enough to last another day. Their home, made of sun-baked mud and patched thatch, stood as both a shelter and a reminder of how fragile life could be. Inside, the wooden table bore the marks of years of shared struggle. Cato watched his parents break a single meal into portions that defied logic, his father dividing food with careful hands, his mother offering her share so naturally it felt like an instinct. They often pretended they had eaten earlier, their gentle lies meant to soften the children's worry. Even as a child, Cato sensed the truth, but he also sensed the unspoken love that lived within those sacrifices. What shaped him most wasn't the emptiness in his stomach, though it was familiar, but the way his community handled that emptiness. Neighbors shared dried beans when they could. Elders accepted help with a grace that honored the giver. Struggling families leaned on one another not out of choice, but out of a deep-seated understanding that no one survived alone. Cato absorbed these moments quietly, storing them like lessons etched into the soft clay of his young heart. His mother, Amina, became the compass guiding him through hardship. She was a woman who carried wisdom the way others carried water, preciously, carefully, and always with purpose. Each evening, as the sky fell into deep shades of amber and blue, she spoke to him with the softness of someone who believed words could be seeds. She told him that wealth was not measured by coins, but by the courage to give even when life took more than it offered. Her voice did not tremble when she said these things. It held the steady conviction of someone who had lived enough to know what mattered. Cato listened with a seriousness far beyond his age. He watched her share the last scoop of porridge with an elderly neighbor. He watched her comfort a mother whose children had gone to sleep hungry. He watched her rebuild hope with nothing more than her presence. These moments shaped him more than any lesson written in a book could have. They taught him that compassion was not a luxury for the comfortable. It was a lifeline for the struggling. As the months passed, the drought worsened. The river shrank into a narrow ribbon of muddy water. Children walked slower, their steps heavy from exhaustion. Families whispered worries into the dark, so their fear would not frighten the little ones. Hunger became the quiet companion of every household, settling at tables where meals should have been. Yet even in this struggle, Cato found resilience pressing against his ribs, a strength that grew silently with every difficult day. What he didn't know was that his heart, shaped by scarcity, strengthened by love, and sharpened by observation, was preparing him for something far greater than survival. It was preparing him for a choice that would reveal who he truly was, long before the world ever learned his name. And on one pale morning, when the sun rose heavily and the smell of cooking fires drifted faintly through the air, Amina placed a rare full lunch into Cato's hands. It was the kind of meal he hadn't seen in weeks, the kind that could carry him through a long school day. But fate was already approaching him quietly, step by step, in the form of someone more desperate than he had ever been. In a few moments, that single lunch would test everything his mother had ever taught him, and the boy he would become depended entirely on the choice he was about to make. Some days arrive quietly, carrying nothing unusual on their surface, yet beneath them hides a moment that can redirect a lifetime. That morning, Cato walked the familiar dusty path, believing it would be no different from the countless mornings shaped by hunger. But destiny often waits in the shadows of ordinary routines, revealing itself only when a heart is brave enough to answer its call. The sun had barely risen above the distant hills when Cato stepped into the small kitchen space, expecting nothing more than the usual emptiness that greeted him each day. Yet this morning felt strange, touched by a rare softness. His mother stood by the wooden stool, holding a cloth-wrapped bundle, her hands moving with the quiet precision of someone preparing a gift she wished could have been bigger. Inside was a full lunch: rice, beans, and a small piece of dried fish, an offering so precious it made Cato hesitate before touching it. His mother smiled with a kind of tenderness that carried both pride and apology, as if she wanted her son to know this moment had cost her more than she would ever say aloud. For a heartbeat, Cato simply held the bundle against his chest, absorbing the warmth of her sacrifice. The path to school stretched ahead, familiar yet softened by the comfort of the food in his hands. Villagers moved slowly through the morning haze, their silhouettes framed by red earth and golden light. Cato walked with a lightness that came not from fullness, but from the rare luxury of having something to look forward to. His stomach, always the first to complain, seemed almost patient today. He caught himself imagining the taste of the rice, the texture of the beans, the small treasure of the fish. It felt like a promise, fragile, temporary, but real. Halfway to school, he noticed something out of place beneath the shade of an acacia tree. A small shape, unmoving, curled into the dust as though clinging to whatever comfort the earth could offer. Cato slowed, then stopped altogether, his breath catching as he recognized the frail outline of a child. A younger boy, his limbs thin and trembling, his face carved with exhaustion. The sight pulled Cato back into memories he had tried to bury. Nights when hunger stole sleep, mornings when he could barely stand, times when his own reflection frightened him. He approached carefully, kneeling beside the boy whose eyes fluttered open with desperate effort. Those eyes told a story Cato knew too well: fear, weakness, surrender. The boy tried to speak, but his voice dissolved into the dry air. His breathing was shallow, each inhale a quiet plea for strength. Cato felt the cloth bundle grow heavier in his hands, as though it understood the choice standing silently before him. Without speaking, he untied the bundle and placed the food gently in the boy's lap. The child stared at it as if it were a miracle dropped from the sky, then looked back at Cato with a confusion that slowly softened into gratitude. When he finally began to eat, it was with a trembling urgency that tugged at something deep within Cato. Watching him, Cato felt hunger tighten inside his own stomach, but the ache no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a reminder of why this moment mattered. He waited patiently until the child finished every bite, regaining a faint glow of strength. Cato did not ask his name or his story. He simply stood and offered a reassuring nod before continuing toward school. The path seemed longer now, the sun harsher, and his steps heavier with fatigue. But beneath the hunger settling back into his body, a strange calmness spread, a quiet knowing that he had honored something sacred, taught to him, long before he understood its weight. Throughout the school day, concentration slipped through his fingers. His body grew weak, but his heart remained steady. Each time his mind drifted, it returned to the boy beneath the acacia tree, to the fragile breath he had helped steady, to the gratitude he had seen flicker in those tired eyes. He did not think of heroism. He thought only of instinct, of kindness, of the simple decision that had felt both natural and necessary. When he returned home later that evening, exhausted and faint, his mother noticed the emptiness of the wrapping cloth but asked nothing. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder with a quiet understanding that warmed him more than any meal could. Cato went to sleep, feeling a tenderness he could not explain, unaware that the story of what he had done was already moving far beyond him. And somewhere in the village, the child he had saved spoke softly of the boy who gave away everything he had. Those gentle words spread from one ear to another, beginning a chain of events Cato could not see. Events already shaping a future waiting patiently for him just beyond the horizon. Kindness rarely echoes loudly, yet when it does, it shakes the hearts of those who witness it. One quiet act beneath an acacia tree began to drift through the village, like a soft wind carrying a secret. People heard it, felt it, and paused, because in a place carved by hunger, compassion carried a power far greater than anyone expected. By the next morning, whispers of what Cato had done moved through the village with a tenderness that surprised even the elders. They heard how a boy, weakened by his own hunger, had given away the only meal he had. The story passed from one ear to another, gathering warmth each time it was repeated. Elders who had lived long enough to see generosity fade in the face of hardship felt their hearts stir with an emotion they hadn't felt in years: hope. And teachers, who often watched children struggle to learn on empty stomachs, began speaking his name with a kind of pride that softened the walls of the small schoolhouse. The teachers called him aside after class, not to scold or question him, but to look at him with eyes full of quiet admiration. They asked him gently why he had done such a thing, though the answer was already written across his face. Cato struggled to explain, stumbling over words until he finally said that hunger was not just an ache, it was a kind of loneliness, and he could not walk away from someone carrying that pain alone. His voice trembled, not with regret, but with sincerity so raw that the teachers found themselves momentarily lost for words. They sensed something in him, something steady and rare, the kind of spirit that hardship could not break. The hungry boy's family arrived at Cato's home a day later. His mother opened the door to find the child, now standing with a bit more strength, and his parents behind him. Their expressions were full of deep gratitude, the kind that lived in the eyes long before it reached the lips. They offered Cato's family a small basket of ground nuts, a gift far greater than its size. In a community where every handful of food mattered, it was a gesture of profound appreciation. Cato's mother accepted it with grace, her eyes shining with quiet pride. She looked at Cato in a way that told him she saw the man he was becoming, even before he saw it himself. From that day forward, villagers looked at Cato differently. When he walked through the market, people greeted him with warmth instead of the usual distracted nods. Elderly women called out blessings as he passed, and men stopped him to ask about school, offering small tasks that paid a few coins. He began helping carry water, stacking, firewood, sweeping compounds, simple things that earned him the trust of neighbors who had once seen him only as another child fighting against scarcity. Their belief in him grew slowly but steadily, like a seed finally given enough light to sprout. For the first time, Cato felt a stirring inside him, a sense of purpose that reached beyond his own survival. He noticed the quiet shift, how people leaned toward him when they spoke, how children followed him with admiration, how adults seemed to expect integrity from him as though it had always been his name. These early threads of responsibility wrapped around him gently, hinting at a future calling he couldn't yet understand. He was still a child, but something within him was growing into a shape far larger than his years. Yet beneath the encouragement and recognition, poverty refused to loosen its grip. Food remained scarce. Days of hunger grew more frequent. His father's work became unpredictable, and his mother's health began to carry the exhaustion of too many sacrifices. Cato saw the strain in their eyes each morning, the quiet fear tucked beneath their determination. The weight of his family's struggles pressed heavier on him, now that he understood how fragile their survival truly was. As villagers praised him, he couldn't ignore the truth waiting inside his home. Kindness did not fill empty pots. Admiration did not calm growling stomachs. Love, though abundant, could not stop the drought from tightening around them like a fist. And Cato, young as he was, felt the undeniable shift between admiration and obligation. He wanted to help more than he could explain, but the question gnawed at him in the quiet hours of dawn. How could a child carry the weight of a family's survival? And so, as praise grew louder, the reality of poverty grew harsher, pushing him toward a choice no child should ever have to make, a decision that would change the direction of his life and cost him a part of his childhood he could never reclaim. When life demands sacrifice, even a child's dreams must bow to the weight of necessity. It is in these moments, when innocence is forced to confront reality, that childhood quietly slips away, leaving behind a young soul shaped far too early by the burdens of adulthood. For Cato, this shift arrived not with drama, but with the slow tightening of hunger around his family's daily life. As weeks passed, food at home became scarce enough that the fear in his father's eyes grew deeper each morning. The once gentle conversations between his parents began carrying the quiet urgency of people running out of options. Nights stretched longer, filled with whispered worries and the soft rattle of empty pots. School, once a fragile gateway to hope, gradually became a luxury they could no longer afford, not because of fees or uniforms, but because every hour Cato spent in the classroom was an hour his family drifted closer to hunger. He sensed the change before anyone said it out loud, noticing how his parents avoided meeting his gaze, as though the truth would feel like a betrayal. One morning, his father finally placed a hand on his shoulder, the kind of touch that carried more apology than instruction. He explained gently that the family needed another set of working hands. Cato nodded with a maturity far beyond his age, though a quiet ache rippled through him as he folded his school books for the last time. Leaving school didn't feel like giving up. It felt like stepping into a role he had been preparing for without realizing it. But as he walked away from the classroom, hearing children recite their lessons behind him, he felt something inside him loosen and fall away, like a leaf surrendering to wind. Work for a boy his age was scarce, but desperation sharpened his determination. He began taking any job that earned even a few coins. Some days he carried heavy water containers for village women whose strength had been eroded by years of scarcity. Other days he stood in the fields from sunrise to dusk, helping farmers turn sun-baked soil that barely yielded crops. When market season arrived, he hauled sacks of grain, cleaned stalls, and ran errands until his legs trembled. And when men building new huts and shops needed laborers, he joined them, lifting bricks and mixing mud under the blistering heat. He was too young for such tasks, but hunger rarely left space for youth. Each job carved new discipline into him. Every coin he earned came laced with fatigue, but also with a strange sense of pride, because he knew he was helping keep his family afloat. In those early days of labor, he discovered something unexpected about himself. Hardship deepened his empathy instead of hardening him. Whenever he received a small piece of fruit or a leftover meal from an employer, he often found himself sharing it with someone who had nothing at all. It wasn't an act he planned. It came from the same instinct that once made him kneel beside a starving boy beneath an acacia tree. Kindness, he realized, did not shrink when tested. It grew. Even as exhaustion accumulated in his bones, Cato held on to a quiet, internal drive that surprised him. He watched older workers, studied how they managed their strength, observed how the most respected among them carried both humility and skill. Each day became a classroom, even without walls or a chalkboard. He learned the value of time, the necessity of patience, and the quiet power of endurance. His hands grew stronger, his posture more confident, and his understanding of people deeper. The village began to see him not as a child forced into work, but as someone who carried the dignity of a grown man, long before his age allowed it. Yet beneath this growing resilience, a quieter truth lived, one he barely acknowledged even to himself. There was still a spark inside him, a yearning to help others that only grew sharper as he witnessed more hunger, more struggle, more silent suffering. He didn't know what to do with that feeling yet, but it lingered within him like a soft flame refusing to die out. The days blended into one another, marked by the rhythm of work, the ache of fatigue, and the simple joy of contributing to his family's survival. Poverty had taken his childhood, but it had also forged in him a strength few children carried. And though he didn't realize it then, his journey toward purpose had already begun taking shape in the shadows of these long, demanding days. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, as he wiped sweat from his brow and prepared to leave another long shift, a stranger's gaze lingered on him, sharp, thoughtful, recognizing something in him that no one else had truly seen. In that single moment, Kato's path began to shift once again. Sometimes, the right person recognizes greatness long before the world acknowledges it. Greatness does not always roar. Sometimes it hides quietly in the gestures of someone who gives without expecting anything in return. And for Kato, the moment someone finally saw the depth of his heart arrived on a day that looked painfully ordinary. Dusty streets, empty pockets, tired limbs, and yet a generosity that refused to yield. Workdays had begun blending together, each one a repetition of sweat, labor, and quiet exhaustion. Kato earned just enough to bring home a few coins, sometimes a handful of grain, sometimes nothing at all. Yet even in those tight margins of survival, he continued sharing small portions of food with children who hovered near the marketplace, waiting for the kindness of anyone who had a little more than they did. It wasn't something he announced or displayed. It was simply who he had become, a boy who understood hunger intimately and refused to let others face it alone. When he purchased a small piece of cassava or a roasted maize cob, he instinctively broke it into pieces, handing out parts to hands smaller than his own. One afternoon, as he sat beneath a weathered awning sharing his meager lunch with 3 hungry children, he felt eyes lingering on him, not with suspicion, but with thoughtful curiosity. A man stood a short distance away, leaning lightly on a wooden walking stick, observing Kato with the kind of attention one gives to something unexpectedly remarkable. The man's clothes were simple but clean, and his calm presence carried a quiet authority. He watched until the children had eaten everything Kato offered, and only then did he approach. He introduced himself as a worker from a nearby charity group, one that operated a small community kitchen dedicated to feeding the poor. He had been in the area to assess needs among market workers, but what caught his attention was not the poverty, he had seen that his whole life, but the way Kato navigated it. He told Kato that rare was the person who shared from abundance, but even rarer was the person who shared from scarcity. Those were the people who reshaped communities. Those were the people who changed lives. The man asked Kato if he was willing to help at the kitchen. The offer felt both frightening and strangely perfect. Kato hesitated only long enough to understand the weight of the opportunity. Helping feed children was something he already did in small ways. Doing it on a larger scale felt like stepping into a purpose he didn't yet fully understand. He accepted with a quiet nod, and the man's smile widened with relief, as though he had been hoping for this answer long before he asked the question. The community kitchen became Kato's new world, one filled with lessons he never expected. He learned how to stretch ingredients, how to measure portions so that every person received enough, how to store food safely, how to manage supplies with precision. He learned budgeting, how each coin, if respected, could multiply. He learned timing, how meals had to be ready when hunger was at its sharpest. Most importantly, he learned structure. Feeding people was not just an act of kindness, it was a system that, when organized well, could change the fate of entire neighborhoods. Every day, he watched lines of villagers walk into the children with hopeful eyes, mothers carrying babies on their backs, elderly men whose hands but who still carried dignity in their posture. Kato saw slowly, and the fear that gripped him felt deeper than anything hunger had ever taught him. And when the doors of the kitchen finally threatened to shut for good, leaving hundreds without their only meal, Cato stood in the empty hall with one impossible choice before him: walk away like everyone else, or stand alone against a problem far larger than himself. Crisis often reveals the hidden strength a person never knew they carried. When familiar walls collapse and the ground beneath one's feet begins to tremble, the world quietly watches to see who will rise. Cato had always given from the little he had, but now life was demanding something far greater than generosity. It was demanding leadership. The day the community kitchen shut its doors, the village felt a shift in the air, as though a warm flame that had kept their hope alive had flickered out without warning. The staff left with heavy steps, each person carrying the guilt of being unable to do more. Pots sat empty on their shelves, fires lay cold beneath the large cooking stones, and the once bustling courtyard fell silent. But the deepest silence lived in the faces of the children who wandered toward the locked building, waiting for the meals that no longer waited for them. Their confusion, their disappointment, and the quiet fear behind their eyes pierced Cato deeper than any hunger he had ever endured. He watched the elders sit along the dusty road, their tired hands resting on walking sticks as they whispered uncertainly about where their next meal would come from. Mothers clutched their little ones closer, pretending they were not frightened, even as their voices trembled with forced reassurance. Hunger once again tightened its grip around the village, pressing against every door it passed. Cato felt that pressure most acutely because he had spent months witnessing exactly what food meant to these people. Not just nourishment, but dignity. Walking through the empty halls of the closed kitchen felt like stepping into a memory being erased. The scent of cooked rice still lingered faintly in the air, clinging stubbornly to the stone walls. He placed his hand on the main serving table, feeling the smooth surface that had once held countless bowls. There he understood something with painful clarity. If he walked away now, the very people who had come to depend on him would lose the only heartbeat of hope left in their daily lives. The weight of that realization settled into his chest, not as fear, but as responsibility. He did not have money. He did not have supplies. But he had something the kitchen never taught him: courage shaped by hardship and compassion shaped by hunger. So he gathered what little he could: 2 borrowed pots from neighbors, a bundle of firewood, leftover grains donated by a sympathetic shopkeeper, and a handful of vegetables given by an old farmer who believed in him. He placed everything beneath the shade of a massive baobab tree in the center of the village, lit a fire, and waited for the water to boil. At first, only a few villagers approached, their expressions hesitant, unsure whether this small effort could ever replace what they had lost. But when they saw Cato, his posture steady, his hands moving with familiar precision, they remembered the young man whose heart had fed children long before he had the means. Slowly, they came closer, and as the aroma of boiling broth drifted through the air, people began to line up, not because the meal promised fullness, but because they trusted the sincerity behind it. He served each person with the same care he had learned in the kitchen. Children received their food first, followed by elders, then mothers, then everyone else. The portions were modest, stretched carefully, but they carried a comfort nothing else could have offered that day. Some cried quietly as they accepted their bowls. Others simply held them close, inhaling with gratitude. Cato felt exhaustion settle into his bones, but a deeper emotion rose to replace it: purpose. His first self-led feeding had become more than a meal. It had become a symbol that hope did not require resources. It required resolve. Word spread quickly through the village that someone refused to let hunger win. As the sun dipped low and the last flames from the fire softened into embers, Cato wiped his hands on his worn clothes, believing the long day had finally ended. The line had disappeared, the pots were nearly empty, and silence returned to the baobab tree. But then, Just as he prepared to leave, one final figure stepped forward from the fading light, a presence carrying not just gratitude, but a connection reaching back into Cato's earliest memories, a thread of his past walking toward him with purpose. And as the figure drew closer, Cato realized this was no ordinary visitor, but someone whose return would unravel a chapter of his life he never expected to revisit, one that would change everything. Yet again, fate always remembers its origins, and sometimes it returns in human form, carrying the quiet proof that even the smallest kindness can echo far beyond the moment it was given. Cato had no way of knowing that a single shared meal years earlier had set another life in motion, a life that would one day circle back to meet him at a crossroads he never imagined he would reach. The afternoon heat settled gently over the village when Cato finished serving the last bowls of food beneath the massive baobab tree. The embers of the fire glowed faintly, the scent of cooked maize lingering in the air, like a soft reminder of what had been accomplished despite impossible odds. He felt exhaustion in his muscles, yet a quiet satisfaction settled into him, an understanding that even with scarce resources, he had refused to let hunger claim the people he cared for. As he began to clean the borrowed pots, footsteps approached from a distance, unhurried, yet purposeful, as though carrying a message shaped long before that moment. When Cato lifted his head, he saw a young man standing before him, a tall, lean teenager with familiar features softened by time, but sharpened by determination. There was a flicker of recognition, a memory tugging insistently at Cato's mind. It took a moment for the years to fall away, but when they did, Cato's breath caught quietly in his chest. The boy standing before him was the same starving child he had once found shivering beneath a tree, the same child to whom he had given his only meal on a morning that had nearly broken him. But now the boy was older, stronger, and carrying an expression of gratitude that ran deeper than words could reach. The young man greeted him with a quiet reverence, explaining that he had never forgotten the day Cato gave away his lunch. He described how that single act carried him through more hunger-filled seasons, reminding him that kindness existed even in the harshest years. He told Cato about the employer he now worked for, a shop owner who believed in giving back to the community, and how he had convinced them to contribute food items to support the effort he had heard about in the village. Then he stepped aside and revealed a small cart filled with grains, vegetables, cooking oil, and even a few precious spices, each item a testament to the compassion that had once saved him. For a moment, Cato stood still, overwhelmed by a mixture of disbelief and humility. He had never expected gratitude to return to him, let alone in such a tangible form. The villagers who watched nearby murmured quietly, their eyes widening with recognition of the moment unfolding before them. It felt as though the past and present had met beneath the baobab tree, binding themselves together in a way that made everyone believe change was possible. When the young man spoke again, his voice carried the quiet strength of someone who had come not just to repay kindness, but to support a mission he believed in. The donation sparked something powerful within the community. Word spread rapidly that someone whose life had been touched by Cato now returned to strengthen his work. Villagers who had once offered him hesitant support began stepping forward with renewed conviction. Some brought vegetables from their farms, others donated firewood, and a few brought coins saved over months of careful living. What had begun as a desperate attempt to keep people fed slowly transformed into a gathering place, one shaped by unity, trust, and shared purpose. The baobab tree became more than a feeding spot. It became the village's symbol of resilience. Cato felt the shift as though it were happening inside him as well. He watched the way people worked together, the way lines formed with dignity rather than desperation, the way children ran toward the shade of the tree with laughter instead of fear. He realized that this effort was no longer held together by his hands alone. It had become something larger, something living, something that carried the weight of a community's hope. and in the quiet space between serving one bowl and the next, he felt a realization rise within him. This was not chance, nor luck, nor coincidence. This was a call. This was the purpose of reaching out to claim him completely. But purpose often demands sacrifice. As the crowds grew and the needs expanded, Cato understood that the little he had would no longer be enough. If he wanted the feeding effort to grow, if he wanted to ensure no elder went hungry and no child slept with an empty stomach, he would have to risk what little comfort he had earned to step into a challenge that threatened everything he possessed. And as he stared at the growing line the next morning, he knew there was no turning back, for to rise further, he would have to risk everything he owned, stepping into a future where the stakes were higher than ever before. Dreams grow when a person dares to let go of everything that once kept them safe. There comes a moment when security feels like a quiet prison, when the familiar begins to suffocate possibility. And for Cato, that moment arrived with the undeniable clarity of a man who understood that protecting a small life meant turning his back on a greater purpose waiting to be born. The morning after the reunion beneath the baobab tree, Cato found himself unable to sit still. He drifted through the village in deep thought, his mind replaying the sight of the growing lines, the gratitude shimmering in the eyes of elders, the laughter of children who had once known only hunger. Something inside him had shifted permanently. The work he was doing was no longer a temporary response to crisis. It was a responsibility, a calling, a duty he could not turn away from, no matter how overwhelming the future appeared. And with that realization came the stark truth. If he wished to feed more people, he had to risk everything he had built so far. Over the following days, he made decisions that would have terrified a less determined heart. He gathered his modest belongings, his old tools from days laboring in fields, his spare clothes neatly folded in a woven basket, the handful of items he had managed to collect through years of hardship, and began selling them piece by piece. Each item carried a memory, yet each sale carried a purpose. The coins he earned were not just currency. They were the seeds of something far greater. Friends and neighbors questioned him with concern, urging him to keep at least some possessions for himself. But Cato only smiled gently and reminded them that true security came not from what one owned, but from what one built. When he had collected enough, he rented a small, weathered space on the edge of the village, a structure so humble it barely looked like the birthplace of a dream. Its walls were cracked, its roof needed repairs, and its floor was just compacted earth. But to Cato, it felt like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. He cleaned the space from dawn until dusk, sealing holes, repairing doors, smoothing the floor, and shaping the room into something usable. When he finally stood in the middle of the nearly empty room, he felt a stirring of pride. It was not perfect, but it was his. It was the first foundation stone of a permanent community kitchen. Word spread quickly that Cato had taken this daring step. Villagers arrived carrying whatever they could spare: bundles of firewood, baskets of cassava, dried beans stored for hard seasons, vegetables from gardens, even coins saved from months of careful budgeting. The small building filled slowly with supplies and warmth, not from wealth, but from unity. Women came to help chop vegetables, young men fetched water from the river. Elders offered recipes passed down through generations. For the first time, the act of feeding the hungry felt like a communal heartbeat, steady, strong, and growing louder each day. Once the kitchen opened, its impact was immediate. Children who once wandered the village with hollow eyes now arrived each morning with anticipation. Elders no longer sat waiting in uncertainty. They came with slow but hopeful steps, knowing a warm meal awaited them. Travelers passing through the region paused in disbelief at the sight of such generosity flourishing in a place so modest. The scent of simmering stews drifted through the village, drawing together people who had long grown accustomed to solitude, shaped by hardship. Cato moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, guiding volunteers, stirring pots, managing supplies, and organizing schedules, all with the same quiet determination that had carried him through every season of struggle. Within months, the kitchen became a lifeline, not just for his village, but for neighboring ones as well. Families traveled miles for a single bowl of food, trusting the consistency he had built. People spoke his name with respect, not because of what he claimed to be, but because of what he had proven through action. Cato's reputation spread farther than he ever intended. Stories of a young man who sacrificed everything to feed others began to reach markets, towns, and eventually cities. He remained unaware of how far his story had traveled, too focused on the work in front of him to imagine that the world was quietly turning its gaze toward him. But destiny rarely waits politely at the door. It arrives suddenly, without warning, and often in the form of people who carry greater shifts in their footsteps. And one morning, as Cato prepared the first pot of the day, a group of journalists stepped into the kitchen, cameras in hand, hearts already moved by the story they had come to uncover, ready to change the course of his life in ways he could never have foreseen. A quiet life can become a national voice when truth finally finds an audience. Sometimes the world needs only one story, one honest, unpolished story, to remember the power of compassion. And when Cato's humble journey slipped into the hands of those who could amplify it, his life, once shaped by silent hunger, began echoing across an entire nation. The journalists who arrived at his small kitchen spent hours observing him, taking notes as he stirred large iron pots with movements shaped by years of discipline. They followed him as he organized volunteers, greeted villagers, and checked supplies with precise care. But what captured them most was not the work he did. It was the sincerity behind every gesture, the quiet humility in every answer he offered, and the unmistakable purpose that radiated from someone who had risen from hardship without bitterness or pride. They listened as elders recounted how he had stood alone when the kitchen failed, how he had sold his belongings to build a new one, and how he had turned a village's despair into a flame of hope bright enough to light whole communities. When the journalists returned to the city and published his story, it spread with a force no one expected. Newspapers headlined his name with reverence, radio programs discussed his courage, and television stations aired footage of children lining up for meals beneath the shade of the baobab tree. Viewers across the nation saw a young man who had every reason to walk away from hunger, yet chose to confront it with dignity and determination. His story struck a chord deep in the country's heart, awakening empathy in people who had long grown numb to tales of struggle. Within days, donations began pouring in. Some came from wealthy families moved by memories of their own difficult beginnings. Others came from ordinary citizens who could spare only small amounts, but wanted to be part of something meaningful. People mailed bags of rice, cans of beans, sacks of maize, envelopes of cash, handwritten notes of encouragement, and even clothing for children who visited the kitchen daily. What touched Cato most were the messages from strangers who confessed they had once known the sting of hunger and finally found someone who understood them without judgment. Soon, NGOs began reaching out, organizations with resources, infrastructure, and experience in humanitarian development. They offered partnerships, training, and funding. They sent nutritionists, logistical planners, and community organizers. For the first time, Cato had access to tools he never imagined he would use: bulk food storage methods, agricultural support programs, transportation vehicles, sustainability models, and community outreach structures that transformed a single kitchen into a scalable movement. Each new partnership reminded him that his work was no longer the effort of one man. It was becoming a collective uprising against hunger. With greater support came expansion. Cato established feeding centers in neighboring villages, each modeled after the original kitchen's spirit of respect and unity. Small buildings were renovated, volunteers were trained, and supply routes were set across dusty roads and dense footpaths. What began as a desperate act of one boy's compassion had become a coordinated effort feeding thousands each week. Mothers who once feared their children would starve now carried them with relief. Elders who had once felt forgotten found themselves welcomed with dignity at tables that honored their presence. The impact rippled beyond food. Cato hired young people from impoverished backgrounds, offering them training and stable work. Many of the same boys, who once roamed aimlessly, now learned how to coordinate schedules, manage deliveries, and communicate with partner organizations. Young women who had felt limited by circumstance found themselves leading teams, organizing storage facilities, and assisting in nutrition planning. Employment brought not only income, but pride, a renewed belief that they could contribute to reshaping their communities. As his network of kitchens grew, so did the respect surrounding his name. Newspapers labeled him the boy who fed a nation. Social groups invited him to speak, though he always approached such invitations with humility, often reminding people that hunger was the real enemy, not a story to be glorified. His quiet voice carried more force than speeches delivered from grand stages. His sincerity became a national anchor in a time when many had grown weary of empty promises. Yet with recognition came new possibilities, opportunities that reached far beyond what Cato had imagined when he first stood under the baobab tree, holding borrowed pots and leftover food. And destiny, sensing his readiness, sent someone who could push his mission into an even wider horizon. One afternoon, as volunteers sorted supplies and villagers shared conversations beneath the soft glow of evening, a government official stepped into the kitchen, carrying a proposal so large, so transformative, that it threatened to reshape not only Cato's work, but the future of hunger relief across the entire nation. With great opportunity comes a responsibility powerful enough to reshape a nation. Some invitations do not arrive simply to reward a person. They arrive to test whether their spirit can hold the weight of change. And as Cato stood before the government official, he felt the unmistakable pull of a destiny far larger than anything he had imagined beneath the humble baobab tree. The meeting took place in the most unassuming corner of Cato's kitchen. The official, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, did not ask for a formal room or a prepared presentation. Instead, he chose to stand by the doorway, quietly observing the line of villagers receiving their evening meals. He watched babies clinging to their mothers' shoulders, elders murmuring blessings before eating, and volunteers moving with the confidence of people who believed deeply in what they served. When he finally turned to Cato, his expression carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the nation's hunger crisis from a distance for far too long. The official explained that the government had followed Cato's rise closely. They had seen how a single young man, with no wealth or political power, had accomplished what countless committees and programs had failed to deliver: consistency, trust, and a system built on compassion rather than bureaucracy. Then came the proposal, bold, sweeping, and nearly overwhelming. The government wanted to establish a national food program modeled after Cato's community kitchens. They would supply land, funding, transportation resources, and official support. But they needed him to lead the initiative. They needed the boy who shared his lunch, the young man who sold everything, the leader who fed thousands. It took Cato several days to absorb the magnitude of this opportunity. He walked through the village late into the night, his footsteps soft on the worn earth as he considered the impact such a decision could have on millions. He remembered his childhood hunger, the trembling hands of the boy he once fed, the terrified faces of elders when the first kitchen closed, and the countless small moments that had shaped his purpose. He understood that accepting the offer meant stepping away from the comfort of familiar routines, but it also meant ensuring that no child would ever again sit beneath a tree, waiting for a miracle that might never arrive. In the weeks that followed, plans took shape with astonishing speed. The government allocated a parcel of land near a major transport hub, vast, fertile, and strategically placed for distribution. Engineers designed large-scale kitchens capable of producing thousands of meals a day. Roads were repaired to connect rural communities to these new centers. Warehouses were built to store grains, vegetables, and emergency supplies. And at the center of every blueprint, every logistical map, every strategy was Kato. Quiet, steady, and focused, guiding the process with the same humility that had shaped every step of his journey. When the first national kitchen opened, it became a moment the entire country celebrated. Journalists documented families arriving from distant villages, children running into the large dining hall with awe, and elders taking their seats with the dignity they deserved. The aroma of freshly cooked meals drifted across the compound, carrying with it the unmistakable promise of a new beginning. Kato walked through the bustling facility with his sleeves rolled up, assisting cooks, inspecting storage areas, and offering soft encouragement to volunteers who had joined the mission inspired by his story. Soon, additional kitchens rose across multiple regions, each one pulsing with life, each one serving as a beacon of hope where hunger had once carved deep scars. Distribution networks were established using trucks, motorcycles, and community delivery teams to reach remote villages tucked behind forests, mountains, and winding dirt roads. Daily meals became a certainty rather than a luxury. Mothers no longer skipped dinner for their children. Elders no longer endured nights with empty stomachs. Children began attending school with renewed focus and energy. Entire communities warmed under the impact of meals delivered not out of charity, but out of shared humanity. Kato became known across the nation as the man who fought hunger with heart. His face symbolized not fame, but compassion. His leadership inspired young people to volunteer, parents to trust the system, and donors to continue supporting the mission. Yet behind the achievements, he remained anchored in the simplicity that had shaped him from the beginning: quiet, observant, always listening before speaking. But even as his work expanded, even as new regions requested kitchens and food networks strengthened, Kato felt a gentle tug deep within him, a memory shaped by the cracked earth of his childhood, the whispered lessons of his mother, and the early hunger that had carved his purpose. For despite the national praise, despite the monumental progress, one place, one memory, kept calling him home, urging him to return to the soil where his journey first began. True greatness is tested not in faraway achievements, but in the return to the soil that once shaped a person. No matter how high a life rises, it must one day face the echoes of its beginnings, the hunger, the memories, the quiet wounds that never fully fade. And when Kato finally traveled back to his childhood village, he did so not as the boy who once trembled through hunger, but as the man who now carried the strength to rewrite its future. The journey back home unfolded gently, yet every mile tugged at old threads woven deep into his spirit. The drought-stricken landscape he remembered lingered at the edges of his vision. Cracked earth, struggling crops, and the shadows of hardship etched across the land. Yet there was familiarity, too. The shape of the hills, the sound of the dry wind brushing through stubborn patches of grass, the distant outline of huts that had once offered him refuge from the weight of growing up hungry. As he approached the village entrance, an overwhelming mix of anticipation and humility settled into his chest, grounding him more firmly with each step. When news of his arrival spread, villagers emerged from their homes with expressions that blended disbelief, pride, and emotion too heavy for words. Elders who had once watched him stumble through childhood hunger now greeted him with trembling hands, their eyes shining with memories they had carried for years. They remembered the boy who often gave up his own food for others, the boy who worked quietly in fields far too large for his small frame, the boy whose kindness had always reached further than his strength. Now he stood before them, transformed, yet still carrying the same gentleness in his gaze. Kato walked through the village with a reverence reserved for sacred places. Each corner reminded him of a moment that had shaped his resilience. the narrow path where he once shared a meal with a starving stranger, the riverbank where he fetched water during droughts, the rough school building he had left behind when survival demanded sacrifice. But instead of sorrow, he felt a deep, steady purpose rising within him. He had not returned merely to visit. He had returned to rebuild. Within weeks, the transformation began. Cato constructed a fully equipped food center at the heart of the village, ensuring that no child or elder would face the desperation he once knew. The aroma of warm meals soon replaced the quiet dread of empty pots, drawing families each day with a renewed sense of security. Next came the school, a bright structure filled with desks, books, and teachers who believed in the same promise Cato once wished for. Children gathered in classrooms with eagerness, their laughter carrying the sound of futures unburdened by the limitations that once restrained their parents. But perhaps the most profound change emerged from the clean water system he built, a network of pumps and pipes that brought fresh, safe water directly into the heart of the community. Mothers no longer walked miles under the crushing heat. Children drank without fear of illness. Fields regained their strength slowly as water breathed life back into parched soil. Every improvement echoed Cato's own journey, rising from scarcity, building with dignity, and shaping hope where despair once lived. Village nights changed too. Where silence once marked the end of difficult days, now conversations drifted beneath the moonlight. Families planning for school, elders dreaming aloud about new crops, children imagining lives filled with possibility. And at the center of this renewal stood Cato, quietly observing, carrying the weight of both gratitude and responsibility. He realized that he had not simply returned to the place where his story began. He had returned to complete a circle he had unknowingly started as a child, offering his lunch to a stranger. Yet even with food centers running, children learning, and water flowing, Cato sensed that one final act remained. An act that did not involve buildings or systems, but something more profound, something that would reach beyond his generation and into the lives of those yet to come. And as he stood beneath the evening sky, listening to the renewed heartbeat of his village, he understood that one last promise waited for him, one final act that would define his legacy far beyond his lifetime. Greatness is not measured by what a man earns, but by how many lives he lifts with him. True legacy is carved not into monuments or titles, but into the hearts of those who rise, because one person refused to let them fall. And as Cato looked at the nation he had helped reshape, he understood that the hunger he once feared had become the very force that guided him toward a destiny larger than any dream he had imagined as a child. The decision to establish a national foundation did not come from ambition, but from a quiet clarity formed through years of struggle and compassion. Cato realized that feeding people was only the beginning. If hunger was to be conquered permanently, the effort needed structure, vision, and longevity. He spent long nights outlining the foundation's mission, an unshakable vow to ensure that no child, no elder, no family would ever face the sharp edge of starvation again. When the foundation launched, it did so with a sense of gravity, as if the entire nation exhaled at once, recognizing that this was more than an organization, it was a movement. What made the foundation extraordinary was not its scale, but the people who powered it. Many of the volunteers were individuals Cato had once fed in his earliest days, children now grown, mothers who remembered sitting in long lines with infants on their backs, elders who had once taken their meals with trembling hands. They returned not because they were asked, but because his generosity had planted a seed of compassion within them, and now they wanted to share what they once received. Former beneficiaries became cooks, planners, drivers, community coordinators, and educators. Each person carried a story that deepened their commitment, creating a cycle of kindness stronger than any financial contribution could have built. As the foundation expanded, Cato understood that feeding people was only one part of breaking the chains of hunger. He began building training centers across rural and urban regions, places where families learned practical skills that could transform their lives. Farmers were taught sustainable agriculture, mothers received guidance on nutrition and budgeting, young adults learned trades that helped them stand on their own feet, and small entrepreneurs received mentorship that turned their ideas into stable livelihoods. These centers became hubs of empowerment, each one echoing Cato's belief that dignity was just as essential as food. The impact rippled outward like waves spreading across a calm lake. Towns once plagued by hunger saw children returning to school with renewed energy. Cities once overwhelmed by poverty found themselves strengthened by communities determined to uplift one another. Families who had once relied on daily meals from Cato's kitchens now grew their own food or started small businesses, proudly becoming contributors rather than recipients. Regional leaders sought advice from the foundation, while neighboring countries sent delegations to observe the program, hoping to replicate its success. In time, Cato's quiet revolution began crossing borders, inspiring a broader movement across the continent. As the foundation's influence grew, so did the legend surrounding Cato. People spoke of him with reverence, a man whose hands had once trembled from hunger, yet now provided nourishment to thousands. Children learned his story in classrooms. Parents told it around evening fires. Leaders cited his example when discussing national progress. And through it all, Cato remained the same gentle, steady figure he had always been, moving through kitchens and training centers with the humility of someone who knew exactly where he came from and why he had chosen this path. He often returned to the memory of the day he gave away his lunch, a small moment that held the weight of a lifetime. That act had not saved the nation, but it had revealed the truth of who he was destined to become. The boy shaped by empty plates and whispered prayers had grown into a man who gave others the certainty he had once lacked. What he built was more than a program. It was a living promise that no child would be forgotten, no elder abandoned, no family left to face hunger alone. And as he stood before the newest branch of his foundation, watching children run toward steaming pots, volunteers working with practiced harmony, and families walking away with renewed hope, Cato felt a deep, powerful certainty settle into his soul. His journey had never been about overcoming hunger for himself. It had been about lighting a path so others could walk out of despair with dignity. And so, as the world turned its gaze toward him, recognizing the man who transformed a nation through the simple power of compassion, one truth became clear. His story had only just begun, and the chapters ahead promised a reach far greater than anything the world had yet witnessed. If stories of resilience and transformation move your heart, then stay with this channel, because more powerful journeys like Cato's are waiting to be told. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so these African tales of courage and compassion can reach more people who need them. Share this video with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to turn on notifications. The next inspiring story is already on its way.